What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Post-Military Podcast. Today on the show, we have Chris Roberts, who was a Cyberwarfare officer in the Air Force before transitioning out of the service. After the service, Chris worked in IT and then cybersecurity consulting. Chris now runs his own consulting firm that focuses on change management coaching and leadership consulting for small to medium businesses. In the episode, we talk about how to become aware of your emotions so that they do not overwhelm you, diversifying your life values, and much more. One final note, I've included timestamps in the description of the episode, so check those out to see if there are any sections that specifically interest you. Finally, if you like the content and want to support the channel, sharing, and subscribing would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for your time, and let's get into the episode.
Solemnly swear
Do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Post-Military Podcast, the podcast where we give you stories and information for how to better transition into the next chapter of your life. Today with me is a fellow San Francisco liver, Chris Roberts. Chris, how's it going?
Hello, it's great to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
I'm super excited to talk to you because I so rarely get to talk to people on Pacific time. It's nice when I actually get to align schedules and actually record early in the day, because most of the time I'm having to jump through some crazy hoops to facilitate filming over on the East Coast. So this is really
Yes.
nice.
I know,
Yeah.
I work a lot of East Coast hours, so I know the feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking the time on a Thursday to be here. And one thing I want to shout out is you are the 26th episode. When you see this publicly released, we are halfway through the first year of the Post-Military Podcast. So it's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
I
That's
just
awesome.
wanted to bring that up right now. Let's dive into it. Let's tell everyone out there about your military career.
Sure, yeah. So I went to the Air Force Academy. I actually enlisted first, and it was one of those I had really no other clue what I wanted to do. And so, and my sister had enlisted, so I'm like, I'll just enlist. So I actually enlisted first, and then there's and there that I learned about the Air Force Academy and started researching it. And so as soon as I got to like my first permanent station, I applied to the academy, and it's kind of like a whole different route when you apply from within the military than when you apply as a civilian. So you basically kind of go up your chain of command. And so that worked. I got accepted, and like the next year I got to do basic training all over again.
So you went to Lackland, got yelled
Yes.
at by real MTIs, and then you went to USAFA and you got yelled at by cadets.
Yeah, bunch of upperclassmen.
I would imagine that was quite the interesting experience to not only do it twice, but I met real MTIs and they're way scarier than upper class cadets.
There's that. And I think after doing it once, you understand how it's the artificiality of it, how it's it's a game. And so I think when you go through it a second time, the stress levels are way lower. You understand that actually my life will not end if I don't get my bed exactly 6 inches correctly.
If my socks aren't smiling the right way, it's not going to be the end. I'm not going to get kicked out of the service. Yeah, no, I definitely can see that for sure. So
Right.
what did you study while you were in school?
So I did computer science. I think for me, I think it was always a calling, and I always just was attracted to it. And so I knew that they had a really good computer science program. So I think I just jumped right into that. And then right about that time, they were just kicked off their cybersecurity focus, because that was just a big thing at that point. And so I latched on to that. And so I don't know, it was one of those things where it just seemed like a natural fit, and I gravitated right towards it. And so then I basically started studying cyber freshman year at the academy.
And so at that point, did you know that you wanted to go into, what year did you graduate?
Be 2001.
Okay.
And then I snagged a scholarship where I was able to instantly go to the Air Force Institute of Technology and get my master's degree.
Very cool.
And then I went to my first actual job, which was the Information Warfare Center back down in San Antonio.
That's awesome.
Um,
Yeah. What was the cyber landscape like in the military at that point in 2001, right around like the start of the war on terror?
Right. They were definitely still trying to figure it out. And I remember they were in many ways copying the air warfare center. Like this is how we do exercises and training for air combat. And they were copying that over to say, well, maybe we should just something a similar model for cyber combat. And some of that translated, a lot of that didn't translate. So I think there was definitely a lot of figuring out how do we operationalize this concept.
That must have been really cool for you to be able to put time into crafting that policy, getting to educate people on how cyberspace really functions comparatively to conducting an air war, especially as a second
Right.
lieutenant.
Yeah, I think it did offer the opportunity to approach a problem set and really try to be innovative about it in a way that probably couldn't have in a lot of other areas because it's been operationalized for decades. And and this was the sort of everyone was trying to figure it out. So I think you got a lot of opportunities as a second lieutenant that you might not have gotten, say, in a standard air warfare center.
Definitely, because it was very much so at the time, like this complete gray area, and no one had seniority because no one had ever done it before. So it was,
Right.
I think it, I always, the idea of cyber always really appealed to me because you're always on the bleeding edge
Hmm.
and there's always going to be something new that resets the idea of the experience hierarchy. Like everyone knew what was
Right.
up recently, and then generative AI kicks off and now it's like there's this whole new thing that no one's really an expert on yet. So whoever gets there first, like you can almost rebuild that social hierarchy, which I always think is really interesting because in 5 years something else is going to come out and it's going to completely like
Right.
knock that out again. So
It was also interesting, I think, just over the course of my career to see how a lot of the weight in the military, we call them tactics, techniques, and procedures. And that essentially fed into and created the initial NIST standards that have now flowed down and are part of your healthcare standards or credit card standards and a lot of these other industry standards that are now auditable and enforced and companies must use. And so was really interesting to see how kind of military kind of created that initial set of cybersecurity protocols.
yeah, it must have been really cool to be at the genesis of all that, and now to see it all used now in your daily in your life, especially going through your career, must have been really cool. And so, when you, how long were you at the Information Warfare Center?
So not very long. I think maybe 3, 4 years, and that gave me my five. And I decided to get out after I served my 5 years.
Mm,
And I think it was just a combination of I don't know. I just wasn't strongly feeling like, yes, the military is for me. And I think it was also a combination of I I had some friends out in Silicon Valley doing really cool stuff. And I just, the .com was still going heavy. And I was like, I wanted to get out there and be a part of that.
When did you start realizing that, hey, this isn't something that I want to continue with? Was that something you knew at graduation, or at what point in your time do you really think that kind of clicked for you?
I think it really clicked maybe like my last year or two in the military. And yeah, there wasn't a real strong defining moment, but I think there was one point where I think I was just researching some different companies, ran across a few out in the Bay Area, and it was just like, wow, it was just like this emotional feeling like that would be really cool to be able to work at some of these really cool companies. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, and I think when that happened, I just said, yeah, it just felt like the right thing to do. I didn't go through like a strong, logical pros and cons decision making process.
Mhm.
It was just like a felt sense.
And I almost think that the felt sense is more important because I think that as emotional beings, our emotions generally override our logic anyway. And
Right.
so if you can feel something strongly, that's almost better than thinking it logically, and then as you make the decision, your emotions go, "Oh man, I don't know. I don't know if this is the right choice."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's totally true. And that is how humans make decisions. And yeah, so, and I typically will like use my brain to override my emotions. So for some reason at that point though, I didn't. I'm just like, yeah, I want to do this.
That's awesome. And so when you made that when you had that kind of clarity of emotion, did you what did you do to start preparing yourself for your transition out of the service at that
Right.
point?
So the first thing I did is just started talking to a lot of people
Mm,
and just get advice. And I think one of the persons I talked to referenced me to basically a recruiting firm. I picked one I use, it's called Cameron Brooks. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I've just started working with them. I know there's several out there. And I think it was one of the best decisions I've made just because they basically did all the hard stuff for me. Like I gave them my stack of OPRs and they created a resume for me. And they do all the translation of military job to civilian language. They taught me how to interview, taught me how to put on a suit, wear it right, other little details they walk you through. And I think that's probably one of the first lessons I learned is knowing what your weakness is. And so interviewing in the civilian world is definitely a weakness and then seek out the people that can support you on that. And of course, I went through a recruiting firm. There's lots of ways you can get that support without necessarily doing a recruiting firm. But I think it's definitely better to get that specific help, like maybe hire a career advisor or career coach. I think the military even offers that. And just rather than trying to just read books and Googling the internet, actually get some expert advice. And that's something that I find myself still following my current point in my career.
I would definitely agree with you. My military transition was heavily informed through the networking and conversations with people in the field that I wanted to be in. And it was really helpful. And I'm also someone who I will always default to asking somebody a question before I ever go look on a wiki or Google something.
Hmm.
And so it's because I think you'll find the best information. So I think that's a really awesome piece of information to not only talk to people, but also recognize what your weaknesses are and find individuals who can help strengthen you or abstract those weaknesses
Right.
from your decision making.
I think the other thing that's important to point out is when you seek out like these like career advisor recruitment firm, they can a lot of times draw a connection that you had no idea there was a connection. Like for example, I had a buddy, I think he was like an army tactical officer and they ended up placing him in like the operations of a biotech, like actually making drugs in the factory. And he was like, I would have never drawn that connection that I would qualify to like make drugs, but they were able to make that connection. Say, actually, you're perfect for this, and this is why. And these companies will snatch you up if you go interview for it. And so that's why it's important to seek out these people that they understand what the job market's looking for that you may not necessarily see.
And you don't know what you don't know. And coming out of the military, we don't know a lot. And so
Right.
leveraging the people who have gone either veterans who have gone before you or individuals or organizations that are really ingrained in that process, you like you
Mhm.
said, they will plug you into places that you didn't even know existed because you frankly have not had the time to find out. And that's okay.
Mhm.
But make sure that you're finding some means of abstracting that, which I think is really important.
It's basically to summarize it, becoming, it's about being aware of your own blind spot
Hmm.
and then seeking out the people that can shine light onto that blind spot.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's an important piece of advice for anybody, not just people who are leaving the military.
Absolutely.
So when you left the service, where did you end up going to work? Where did Cameron Brooks end up placing you?
So I ended up getting placed at Genentech, which is a biotech firm out here in the Bay Area and just working in their IT department. And so, yeah. And so it was very much had like that startup culture, and it was, yeah. And I think it was an exciting and a fun transition. It also was it was difficult in many ways just because I'm going from the military culture, which I think is very much a sort of, especially as an officer, is like make a decision and execute, to, I think it was a combination of both being on the West Coast and being in biotech, and then being like an IT in biotech, which is a very different culture and much more, much more, let's sit back and collaborate to make sure this is the right decision and not move too fast. And a lot more, you have to be a lot more cognizant of everyone's feelings, basically.
That culture shock is something that a lot of people run into when they leave the service.
Hmm.
And so what was that like? What was overcoming that like for you in your first in that role in Genentech?
I was trying to basically kind of help restructure a team to make it a little bit more faster, more innovative. And I think at that time, I was approaching things very much from the head, and very logically, this is what we're going to do. And what I was completely blind to was like the concept of psychological safety, for example, and how if you don't establish that psychological safety, it's really hard to drive change as a leader within a team. And so I was facing a lot of resistance. And so I think for me, I think following my previous example, I actually started working with a coach within the company that offered that. They offered that as a service. And I think by doing that, as again, able to kind of start peering into these blind spots and seeing, oh, I now see how this is creating friction that I actually wasn't even aware that it was creating friction. And I was able to start adjusting the approach a little bit. So I am a big fan of that, whether it's like a former career coach, executive coach, a mentor, or just really forming tight relationships with people, is again seeking out what is that blind spot that I'm not seeing, and finding who could help shine some light on that.
That makes a lot of sense. And when you say psychological safety, when I hear that, I think empathy. But what does psychological safety mean to like? What would you say the definition of that is? Because it's a term that I never heard before.
Yeah, it's a wonky term, but basically, whenever there is change, the- kind of we as humans go into some level of the fight or flight mode, right? We go into self-preservation mode. And so that's especially true if you're trying to do something like reorganize a team and start shifting things around. People can get, it's a emotional thing and it's not always conscious. And so I think the psychological safety is about giving that reassurance of of kind of that where people just feel safe, and it helps turn off that fight or fight response. And it allows people to stay innovative, stay flexible, willing to try something new, willing to experiment. And you'll see like that resistance drop. And I think it's really important whenever you're trying to do a major initiative as a leader.
What can a leader do to build that culture? I don't even know if it's culture, but build that psychological safety within their team.
Yeah. I would say it's two things. I think it's one, you're going to have to, as a group, you want to work with your team. And in many ways, I think it's kind of driving initiative from the bottom up as opposed to a top down, and helping using your team to come up with what is a block that's currently keeping us from doing our best work. What's something we can experiment with to try to work better, faster, and more in a more innovative fashion. And because it's being created in a collaborative fashion, it's not seen as like this foreign thing being imposed by this new guy that just came in,
Mhm.
right? So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is a very similar approach, but one-on-one, having your one-on-one meetings with all your teams members and understanding what their perspective is, and being able to being able to adapt your message to their unique perspective.
Mhm.
And as I say that, I realize that's really generic and hard to say, but it's a difficult situation because there's no, it, the way that looks in every company and every initiative is going to be very different.
And I think that's kind of why it has to be generic, because there's the science of this concept, but then there's also the art of the concept. Because it's like
Right.
you can't, the problem with organizations full of people, it's not a problem, but the nuance of organizations full of people is that problem is going to change. It could be the exact same company, but if you change out the people, then the problem changes because there's different personalities that you have to align to get everybody on board to go in the same direction. And so
Correct.
I think that those kinds of leadership concepts almost have to be generic because the application changes.
Mhm. I think another way to look at it is I think it's real common for people to come at things. And I'll just start with my example. I looked at things very much from an external point of view.
Mhm.
I was looking at, what are the actions and behaviors that people are doing or not doing? And then
Mhm.
what are what's the system I can get people to do the thing that you want to do? And the structures and systems. So
Mhm.
what are the processes? What are the systems? All the external stuff that you typically use to execute an organization. And I was completely blind to the internal stuff. That'll be stuff like culture,
Mhm.
um, stuff like what are the kind of individual motivations and drives that are motivating people. And you have to address both of those. Otherwise, you're going to run into a wall.
They definitely do. And I think that one thing that the military doesn't prepare us for is there really is almost a built in answer to that question of like, at some point, we have to make a decision and everyone has to move with the decision regardless. Like there's a mechanism
Right.
in place for that. And if you don't account for that change in culture, because it is a cultural change when you get out into the world of the rest of the world, that's going to be culture shock because you're going to go, we need to get this done. And someone is going to go, well, I don't like that for valid reasons. And then
Hmm.
you're going to step on them and probably lose the support of that team member because you're accustomed to saying, well, we have to do this regardless. And
Right.
the stakes are just different in the outside world. And I just don't think people talk about that enough.
Yeah. It's a very different culture. And if you just look at the simple fact that in the military, even if regardless of decision a leadership makes,
Mhm.
like the military kind of makes this guarantee you're always going to be taken care of, right?
Mhm.
You're always basically going to have a job as long as you're in the military. And that goes away as soon as you hit the civilian world. And so that psychological safety becomes even more important because people are, oh my God, are they trying to take my job? Are they trying to
Mhm.
force me out? And
Mhm.
that can cause a whole host of that passive aggressive behavior in people.
Yeah. Do you think that the concepts of psychological safety can be applied to someone at the individual level?
Absolutely. And I think that's when you get into those one-on-one discussions a team leader is going to have with team members. I think that's probably where you start applying that.
When I say individual level, I'm saying like, is there things that I can do to build psychological safety for myself in times of change? And the reason why I'm asking is I think that the military, at this point, we've come a long way in preparing service members for their transition in terms of getting a job and VA benefits. I think we're really good at
Right.
that at this point. I don't think we're good at the mental game of the transition. And I think that any life transition is difficult. I think the military transition is more difficult just because it's one of those things where you're coming from a place of really your whole life is wrapped up in this one thing and then that one thing goes away. And
Right.
so, do you think that a person can build psychological safety for themselves so that they can better weather the storms of the transition?
I think that it is something that can help you not just in your transition, but in all aspects of your life. And that it's there's a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is based around this, which is simply becoming aware when you start having like those anxious thoughts and the fears, you start feeling that, becoming aware of that and becoming aware of the thoughts, the stories you're imagining that are generating that. And a lot of times, I remember, at least for me, I was like imagining these stories that are like catastrophizing what's going to happen if I can't get a job. I'm going to be like homeless on the street somewhere or something like these ridiculous stories, but they're going on in the back of your head. And it's not until you really notice them and you frame them that you can get a control of those emotions. And I think it's also good to just being able to build the capacity. So when you have this like anxiety, because you're going through this big life change and you really don't know where you're going to end up a lot of times, is basically building the capacity to just hold that with like a sense of compassion. And you can't necessarily get rid of it. Yeah, you just accept like, yeah, this is a little bit scary. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where this is going to end up. And when you learn to just hold that, the sense of compassion, I think it creates a little bit of distance from it, where it doesn't, like you have anxiety, but you're not like caught up in the storm of it. And I think that really can help just your well-being and then just your ability to move through that period of turmoil more decisively.
I think that's an amazing thing to call out because at least for me, there's been a huge difference in the going, I am anxious versus
Mhm.
I'm in a situation that is causing me to have some anxiety. And the difference
Right.
there is if I'm anxious, that's who I am to the core of my being, and that's never going to change. But if I'm just
Exactly.
in a situation that makes me anxious, that situation will pass, or I can remove myself from that situation, or there's things that I can do to deal with it, or at the very least, it's certainly temporary.
Right.
And I think that for a lot of people, when they leave the military or just go through any major life change, they're going to start feeling all of these emotions. And if you haven't done the cognitive work to recognize these emotions for what they are, you really run the risk of saying, "Oh, I guess I'm just sad now," or "I guess I'm just purposeless now." And that's really bad because that just takes you down into some really scary places. And so I think it's really you talking about understanding you're not in the storm, it's just a thing that's
Exactly.
happening is incredibly
I
important.
think what's real powerful of that is when you're in this storm, the emotions is like this thing that are like bogging you down.
Mhm.
But when you make that shift to something you are, it's something in my experience right now, it's something that I have, you could actually then start using it as like a source of intelligence.
Mm.
And so you may be in a situation, you're like, huh, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety right now. What is my body picking up on that my brain hasn't noticed yet? And it's triggering this anxiety. And oh, I don't know. It's this guy is not behaving the way they normally behave and it's triggering something. Whatever it is, you can use it as like a source of information, a source of intelligence, as opposed to just you're just caught up in it and you're just like just feeling anxious, which you just am.
And if you're caught up in the emotions, then you're going to react emotionally, and that generally is not going to be the our fight or flight animal brain is not great at making logical decisions in our best interest. You just like, and then you just do
Yeah.
something dumb. So it's
Yeah. I think what's the statistic? Like when you could get in a fight or flight, like you lose like half your intelligence.
oh,
Because
I
like
believe it.
literally like blood goes to different parts of your brain and away
Yeah,
from your frontal cortex.
I've certainly had that happen in my life where I look back on it and go, that was a really emotional decision, and it was also really dumb. and I'm really sad that I really regret making that decision. And the other part about the animal brain that I think you called out that I think is really important is, especially in the military, where we're really used to having the stakes be higher, or you just hear about higher stakes. It's like national security, people can die, like all of these like real world consequences.
Right.
Then you go out into the rest of the world where we're blessed to live in America, where the stakes are they're lower for the most part, but human beings, that animal brain has this tendency to fill ambiguous outcome with the worst possible thing, because then we'll avoid getting, back in the day we avoid getting killed because we think of
Right.
the worst possible outcome, and then we just like, I'm just not going to do that. And so we in the at least for me, and it sounds like for you at least at one point in your life, I can catastrophize better than anybody that I know, because I automatically go to those worst case scenarios that I was used to in the military, or just because I don't understand what's happening in the civilian world. Like I remember when I in process, not in process, when I onboarded with Amazon, they gave me a bunch of tasks to do, to like, this is what you need to do to onboard. And it was very clearly like, do these tasks in week 1, do these tasks in week 2, do these tasks within the first month. And I go to my manager the next week and I'm like, I did everything. And they were like, why? Why did you do that? And I was like, I thought we had to get it all done because, and they were like, well, didn't you see the timeline? And I was like, well, yeah, but I didn't want to get yelled at if I was slow. And they were like, why would you get yelled at if you were slow? And then I had to go back and think, people always wanted stuff done faster in the military. And as I was
Yeah.
sitting at home, because I was working from home, like it was very easy because I had that ambiguity and I didn't have that direct guidance. My brain automatically went to, somehow I had completely flipped it in my head and went, if I don't get this done immediately, I'm going to get fired,
Right.
which was crazy. But that's just where I went to at the time, and I didn't have anything to check me. And
Right.
yeah.
And it's really hard in the moment to catch yourself at spinning these stories. Like, if I don't do this, I'm going to get fired. It's really hard to catch yourself in the moment. So it's something that takes practice. I think that you have to develop a practice of journaling where you sit back and say, "Okay, what am I imagining will happen right now if I don't do this?" And catch yourself spinning, oh, I'm like totally catastrophizing this. Or there's several other kind of types of stories. And you can, once you see them though, you can start reframing them to something that's more realistic.
I think the concept of journaling is really important. And are there any other things that you would advise people to do to build that cognitive understanding of self, as a means to prepare for this shift that they will undergo when they're leaving the military, or just any shift that they might experience in their life?
I think that the biggest thing anyone can do is building that skill of self awareness. Because that's when you start noticing the stories, when you start noticing the emotions. And I think kind of the combination of better mindfulness and journaling is probably the gold star standard for building self awareness. And mindfulness doesn't necessarily mean you're sitting cross legged meditating like a Zen monk. It can mean that, but it can also, heck, you can do mindful workouts at the gym. And I think it's all about turning off all the distractions of a world and directing your attention inward and getting really curious. And I think if you're a pure beginner, I think it certainly helps to get a book, maybe even seek out like a coach. But I think once you get the basics down, it's really just it's a matter of practice. It really is, you're building a muscle. Self-awareness is a muscle. So it's just like going to the gym. First, you may need someone to teach you how to use the machines and all that. But after that, it's about going. You just got to get there and do it, exercise the muscle. And I think self-awareness is the same thing.
Yeah, it's cool that you brought up self awareness, because as I talk to more and more people, there's really four things that I think someone needs to be able to move through the chapters of their life or through these major transition points, and it's initiative, community, an understanding of holistic values, and then self-awareness. And
Right.
so I really love that you brought that up. And for anyone listening, we did not plan that. So we're just crushing it right now. That's all. So for you, after you get how long were you at Genetech before you decided to move on to the next role?
I was there, gosh, maybe 5 or 6 years. And then they sold out to Roche. And right about that time, I was moving more into like this as an IT manager role.
Mhm.
And that's about the time I really decided I wanted to get back into pure cyber. And so, and really, like I made this is one of those weird universe things. Like I made this decision. I want to go back to cyber. Literally like that week, like this recruiter randomly calls me and it's just like, hey, would you be willing to interview for this consulting job with this small consulting firm? And I was like, at first I was like, well, I'm not really looking for a job, but I mean, was you can never go wrong with having a conversation. And so I went out to have lunch with the partners of this firm. And I think during that conversation, I was just like, I like these guys. I like what they're doing. Seems like an opportunity. So I made the move.
You've highlighted two different moments in your life where you've had this feeling of doing
Hmm.
something and then you go out and do it. And I think for a lot of people, they might have the feeling, but then they don't have the courage or the initiative to follow through. And why do you think you are able to execute on those feelings so effectively?
I think whenever I did it, I think I always knew that if that turned out to be a bad decision, it turns out to be a horrible company, I don't like it, whatnot. I had so many fallback plans that I could figure out. I could probably go back to my old job. There's other companies out there. I knew I'd be able to figure something out. So I think there's just like confidence in my capacity to find a plan B. And
Mhm.
so, and I think that kind of gave me the confidence just to take that leap when the opportunity presented itself.
Okay. And do you think that how going into your second job was that pretty easy for you? Was it difficult just because you didn't use recruiting? Like you were able
Hmm.
to use the recruiting firm the first time. Were there things that you had to learn this second time that you didn't have to deal with in your first job transition, or was it pretty easy because you had 6 years of like non-military experience under your belt at that point?
I think the main thing that made that shift difficult is I'm going from working in a large company
Mhm.
to working in a small consulting firm where, you know, every day I'm talking to people in completely different companies.
Mhm.
And for every project, I have to build a team from scratch from the consultants in the company. So it's like your team is constantly changing. You're constantly working with different people. You're going into clients that each have very different cultures to the point of I have to, am I wearing a tie or not wearing a tie? Because their bank better wear a tie. If it's not a bank, do not wear a tie. People will look at you funny. And so, I think that was very different because you just have to, there's like this, you have to be, I had to learn to get really comfortable with that ambiguity and that constant shifting ground. Whereas when you work in a company, it's like you go to the same desk every day, you're working with the same people every day, you generally have a stable structure of leadership and culture. And so, and personally, I like the other way. I like all the changing and because you never ever get bored. But it did take a little bit of like a letting go. It's kind of like learning how to surf. You have to just learn to roll with the waves and be comfortable with the fact that you're no longer on solid ground.
What would you recommend to people to be comfortable with ambiguity outside of what you've already talked about? Because I think that for a lot of people going from the military, which is incredibly high structure, to something that isn't, is really difficult. So what would you tell people to do to prepare for that or to better acclimate to an
Right.
environment like that?
To me, that's all emotional intelligence. And that's just building that container, kind of like what we talked about earlier, so that like when you're in that ambiguous moment and wishy-washy, you don't really know what's to do, you don't know if you're doing this right. You're just able to notice that and say, okay, like I really don't know how I'm going to respond in this situation. And I think again, that kind of creates that little bit of distance where you can take that information, you're aware that, okay, this is new to me. I don't know what's happening, but you're not caught up in it. And you're able to then use it as a source of intelligence and maybe use that to help. How can I seek out the information that I don't have right now? Don't talk to people or just realize that the only way I can learn this is to experiment and try stuff and see what doesn't work, which I did a lot of.
I think that having that forgiveness with yourself, being able to recognize that the feelings that we talked about before, I think is really important. And it also seems to me that you seem like someone who's very secure in your identity of self. And
Mhm.
so you're not going to let something at work affect your outlook on life or your perception of yourself because you have cultivated a view of yourself that is almost outside of your job. Like a job is part of you, but it's not the controlling, it doesn't have a controlling stake in your identity or emotions.
That's a really good point. Because I think that, especially in like our culture, people become very identified with their job.
Yes.
Like I am insert your title.
Mhm.
And that can create a lot of anxiety when that starts changing. So yeah, I think if you're able to, you have a job, but you are not your job, I think that creates a foundation of stability outside of the topsy-turvy world of capitalist economies.
Yeah, and it's I think which is really important to recognize because if you heavily identify with your job, anything that affects your job will then have a marketed effect on you. Like if the
Right.
company's sucking right now, you suck. If you
Hmm.
mess up a deal, it's you're terrible. It's not I messed up a deal, it's I'm bad at my life because that is my life. And
Right.
that's a really stressful place to live for
Yeah.
anybody.
It can be very stressful and it can also lead you astray on the flip side, where
Mm,
say if you're killing it, you're closing all the deals, you're getting all the bonuses, you're like getting the promotions, and if you when your identity is your job, you're like, dude, I'm a rock star, and you can become really identified for that. And I think that uh, on one hand, that can set you up for like a major disappointment down the road, but it can also just, that's how people get trapped in like
mhm,
this, where they're in a job for 20 years, they're doing really well, but then it's like all of a sudden maybe they retire and they realize that, oh, I've done nothing but work for 20 years.
mhm,
I haven't had these experiences. My relationships are unraveled. I have no friends. And like all of a sudden you realize that things that are really important to you,
mhm.
you've completely ignored because you've completely identified with a career for, a quarter of your life.
And you sacrifice everything else on the altar of the success of that job. And I think I don't think enough people think about that, especially when you're doing something like the military, where it's all kind of your purpose and your community is all wrapped up in the military. And if you don't take a second to step back and realize that your community, your family, your job, your purpose, like they all are different pieces, they just happen to be all together with the service. When you leave the military, you're going to try and put as much emphasis on your job outside of the military as you did in the military because it's just that's what you just think is right when in reality your job probably shouldn't have as big of an impact on the rest of your life as it did in the service, because the military is a lifestyle, not just a job.
And you have to create a whole new lifestyle. And like your job is just one component of that.
Mhm. Was that something that you had to work through when you left the military and went into Genetech, or was it a relatively easy thing for you to work through? Because it seems like you really
Mhm.
identified a new passion. So I'm not, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think at first I did it. I did exactly what you said, which is like I went for head first into the job. And I was like, 'cause I wanted to rock it, I wanted to make it. And I think I really focused that on most of the time. And even when I came home, I would still think about work. I'd be answering emails at like 10 p.m. It was like all consuming. And yeah, I think there was this awareness that, okay, this is starting to affect my relationships. And I, I see all my friends going out and doing these fun things and I'm just working. I'm like, okay, I need to rebalance. So I had to do like a work life rebalancing.
Mhm.
And yeah, and that's not something you just do. I feel like that's a constant balancing act that you're constantly adjusting. And yeah, it's just the ongoing effort.
Yeah. It really is, because the emphasis you're putting on things will most likely shift as you move through life. But if you're not even aware that's something that happens, then you won't
Mhm.
take the time to do those checkups and say, okay, what do I need to emphasize and what do I need to scale back or like push forward as you do these things. And it really goes back to that emotional awareness of understanding when you're moving through those shifts in your life in the first place, and then taking all of the necessary actions on top of that, which I think is really important.
I think what really kind of helped me is I started realizing that this comes off as nihilistic, but basically the phrase is like, doesn't really matter. And
Mhm.
it's kind of like we were saying about in basic training. You're like freaking out, or is my
Yeah.
bed caller exactly correct? And it's not too late to realize like, it really doesn't matter. And I think you get to the same thing if like one of my projects is getting it delayed or going off the rails. Like at that moment, you're just like, oh my God, you start catastrophizing. I'm going to get fired or whatever. And looking back on it, like all these years later, it's like, they, it's like that little issue, like no one could ever even recall it. It's like that whole project is like forgotten. And so, again, so like in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. And so it's kind of like it's all just a big game. And when you realize that, then all the little things that go wrong, all these issues, you're able to just laugh at it and say, this is just a game. I'm getting yelled at for my bed collar, right? Whatever. And you can laugh at it. And I think it really lowers the stress level and helps a lot with that life balance.
I do think that outlook really, though, is a product of a well organized set of values that exist outside of your job. I think
Right.
that if you don't have that, I really do think you'll catastrophize every little thing about your work, because if your work is all you have or all you identify with, then you're
Yeah.
if you don't catastrophize it, then you have nothing. Like
Because if your work
that's almost
collapse,
really
your
scary.
identity collapse, and that's like
Exactly.
to your brain,
Yeah.
that's death. And so
Yeah,
you
and
respond that way.
it's very funny. It's really interesting. I think we give people one of the most common pieces of financial advice that we give people is like diversify your stock portfolio, because you should never put your eggs in one basket. And it's really interesting that no one takes the time to tell somebody the same thing about their life.
Yeah.
like, like
That's a
it's
good way to think about it.
yeah, we because if you really there are almost no things that exist in this world that can't go sideways or will eventually end. And so if you put your identity in any one thing, at some point, you're setting yourself up for some emotional downturn, or that thing can come to an end, and then you're going to have to start somewhere else. And so,
Right.
why would you ever put all of your eggs in one basket unless you can guarantee that thing is going to be around forever and never change? Which,
Yeah. Which doesn't
yeah,
exist.
yeah, exactly. So it's and so yeah, I think it's a conversation that we just don't have enough. That I wish
Hmm.
we did more, because I think in the military we really do become singularly focused,
Right.
and then we
Well,
have to leave that.
because the military, which is you become cocooned in this system,
Mhm.
and the military itself provides a lot of safety because everything you need is taken care of, right? And I think in our culture, there's still, like, once you get out and you go into corporate America, there's still this lingering, like, you're now part of this company, you're part of this family, and there's still a little bit of that lingering. But I think we all know that's really not true. And I think we live in an age now where it's just like any job is temporary. You're going to move between companies. And I think we're getting to the age where people have like 2 or 3 jobs. You have like your main job and you have like a little side hustle. And that's so common now. And so you have to think of it as you're, like you said, that you're crafting your own structure and you have to build that yourself and determine how you're going to spread out your time. And it's better to spread it out, put your eggs in multiple baskets because neither one of them is permanent.
The non-permanence, I think, is the most important thing, and it's funny that people never think about that in the moment. Like when you're in the military or when you're in a job and you're really just I was watching a movie last night with my wife and my brother. Have you seen Air? Like that movie about the Nike offering Michael Jordan.
Oh, I've heard of
Um
it. I've not seen it.
yeah, really interesting movie. If you're into shoes or into sports, I think it's definitely worth a watch, but the agent that like the agent that was working with them to get Michael Jordan into Nike, he says this really interesting thing of like, I don't have friends, I have clients, and someday I'm going to sell my company for a lot of money, and then I'll worry about making friends after that. And it was this really interesting thing where it's like, wow, that guy's really like singularly focused on this job, and he's really not
Mm,
like, but he recognizes that, which I
right,
found really interesting, because it's like, huh, I guess you can make that singular determination if you've done the evaluation, but so few people, I think, actually have that perspective of like,
right.
I am going to sacrifice everything for the cause. And yeah.
I think it also goes right back to this whole personal development theme that we've been talking about of this whole, and a lot of people get caught on this cycle of if I could just do this,
Mhm.
then I'll be happy. If I could just sell my company, make my millions, then I'll be happy. If I could
Mhm.
just make partner, then I'll be happy. If I could just get into IBM or whatever. It is, but the thing is just once you get there, it's like you're actually not satisfied. It's
No.
the bad thing about the human brain. It's like, okay, now you go back to your set point after your moment of euphoria and you start looking for the next best thing.
Yeah. The
And
pursuit's way more interesting than the acquisition of the thing.
right,
Yeah. I did that. I will tell people that like I felt very alive when I was scheduling all of my networking meetings, trying to figure out what job I wanted to do as I was getting out of the military. I was like, I love this. And then I got my job, and I sit around and go, that's cool. Like, I'm very blessed to be where I'm at, but that like thrill of the hunt was gone. And then it's like, my wife's like, you got a job, like, and I was like, well, maybe I need a different job. And she's like, no, you don't need a different job. You're just you just loved that thing. And that
yeah,
was honestly part of the genesis for the podcast, which was like, I really like seeking people out and figuring them out. And so I was able to leverage that drive elsewhere in my life. But yeah, it really was. I really have felt that where it's like, oh, I got the job.
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah. So there's like this element of, yeah, I think at least knowing that whenever you seek out that next thing, like if it's, that is the thing that you acquisition is not what's going to make you happy. It's the capacity you have to develop it. And you don't need a whole lot to develop that capacity just to be happy where you're at. And so you don't
Yeah.
need to go out and get like the amazing job at the kick-ass company to be happy.
Yeah. It's funny because that desire certainly can manifest itself in many different places in someone's life. Like for me, I have a lot of hobbies that there's always the new thing coming out ever. Like we both ride bicycles, and you
Right.
as like they're always making those bikes like 6 ounces lighter every single year. And
That's,
if you're not careful, your brain can be like,
I need to
imagine
have
how
it.
much faster you would be if your bike was 6 ounces lighter.
I know.
And
Yeah.
so
And it's
there's
even
always that
harder
thing.
when you're bombarded by ads telling you
Yeah.
that, giving you that message that you're going to be so happy if you just go out and buy this.
Yeah.
You're going to have the perfect body. Girls will be all over you if you just go out and buy my tapes or this exercise equipment or my program.
Yeah.
It's real easy to fall into the trap.
Yeah. And I think that going back to the military transition space, I think we've done a disservice to folks that are transitioning out, because I believe that the primary messages are if you get your VA paperwork taken care of and you maximize that to your utmost, and you get a job that's paying more than what you were getting paid in the military, because there's always that conversation. And you knew this, especially in cyber. There's
Mhm.
always like well, I choose to be in, but I could be out there making $500,000 or whatever that number is. And I think that we tell veterans way too much that if you get a job that pays well and you get your VA stuff taken care of, like that is a transition well executed. Where
Yeah.
in reality, I'm not going to say it's meaningless, because taking care of your family and taking care of your VA stuff, those are things for sure, but they're certainly not the things that are going to make you happy. They're just things that are going to
Right.
allow you to sustain your life. And I just think we do a really bad job of telling people that.
Yeah. Because there's so much when it comes to your satisfaction, there's so much more to it than the salary.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that were caught up in the corporate grind, doing an hour commute every day. That's not as big of an issue these days, because so much is remote, but a lot of companies are doing back to work,
Mhm.
back to office, and corporate grind. You're constantly stressed out. And I think when they finally escape that and maybe take a job that's a lower salary, but they have no commute, they're home with their wife and kids, and there's not this constant stress. It's just like the lower salary was totally worth it.
Mhm.
That they're way happy, they're way more fulfilled, and they're actually, even though they have a lower salary, they're going on more vacations. They're going out and doing more things they couldn't do before. And so you have to examine your entire, your lifestyle and how is that going to fit in and what's the kind of lifestyle that you want to be living.
Mhm. I don't think we talk to people about that a lot enough, because I almost feel like people think that every aspect of their life happens in a silo, and they don't bleed into the other aspects of your life. Like, oh yeah, I can just have this job. Like the classic example that I hear from a lot of folks, because I'm an Air Force person, is I'll talk to a pilot that goes, I'm getting out of the Air Force. I'm really tired of deploying. I want to be close to my family all of the time. And I just don't want to be away. And then I go, okay, well, what are you going to do for work? And they go, I'm going to go be an airline pilot. I'm like, well, you're gonna be gone all the time. Like that's like you can pick up less shifts and less flights, but you're gonna get paid less. So like you could do that, but they never think in that terms. They're like, I'm gonna go be an airline pilot, make a lot of money, and it goes, and then it's like, yeah, but you're still gonna be gone. So you haven't even addressed the primary issue at
That you're
hand.
right.
Yeah. But everyone's like, oh, yeah, my job's just my job.
Right.
And I wish more people had that self awareness and that the understanding of like this holistic set of life values
Right.
so they can understand how there's tension between all of these different elements. And you really do have to set a balance of it all versus just these things to have no effect on each other.
That actually may be a good transition because my husband and I, we just had that conversation as he was getting out of the army. Because in a very similar way, he got picked for colonel. And then we started looking at, okay, what is our lifestyle going to be like if you take this promotion? And it's going to be minimum 6 more years, moving every 2 years. You're probably going to be going to faraway places like Korea. We're going to be split apart. And that's just, and you're going to be like working your ass off because colonels are like the back of the army, right? And so, and I think we had to make that decision of like, that's not the lifestyle we want right now. And so we actually passed up the promotion so we could have more agency over the lifestyle that we wanted to create.
It's really mature of both of you to have that conversation. And I think it's beautiful that you're operating as a singular unit, which I think you see in the military with the spouse and the member. Way too many times people are just like, yeah, well, I just have to take this position because like what else am I going to do? And to
Right.
have the maturity to say, what is this lifestyle we want outside of the military service? Like, what does that holistic life look like? And then to make the decision based off of that versus being way too zoomed in on just career and let the career decision determine everything else, I think is really cool
Right.
and something I wish more people did.
Yeah. It's hard to do because especially when you're in the military, like there's so many choices that you're just not given. It's just like
Yeah.
that you're going to live in this spot for the next 2 years. It's like
Yeah.
there's no negotiating over it.
Yeah, and you're just like, okay, I guess yeah, you almost forget that you have agency or that at some point you will have agency. And so then you never build that muscle of figuring it out. And so then when that moment comes, you don't even comprehend that you could do something with it because you're like,
Right.
well, I've never done it before, so why would I start now?
Yeah, we kind of experienced that. It's like after he retired, it's like we literally kind of experienced like this paralysis that we couldn't figure out, well, where do we live? What do we do? And we were just paralyzed. I think we'd gone so long without having to exercise that muscle. And so it took us we ended up getting an apartment in Atlanta for a year just to sit and explore cities, explore kind of career paths and figure out what we wanted to do. But it took us a good year to develop that agency muscle.
When did he retire and when were you guys in Atlanta?
So we were in Atlanta, 2020, 2021.
Okay.
It was pretty recent. And so we were in Atlanta for a year and then like we started mapping out what's the lifestyle we want. And we started with that. And I think we decided we want to live somewhere walkable because whenever we travel, whenever we go places, we have the most fun. We can just walk around to different places. And so in the United States, that's New York or San Francisco.
Yeah.
And then I think basically we were like, well, California is way better weather than
Yeah.
New
No,
York.
that
So
is
that's
100%
literally how we
true.
made the decision to come out
Yeah.
here. And then it's like after we closed the place, we're like, okay, now how do we work our careers around that?
Mm,
And much easier these days because like remote is so
mhm,
accepted now.
mhm.
But that's totally backwards. And I think we would have done it in the past, which is get a job first. And that dictates where you're going to go. And then you figure out where you're happiest in that spot.
Yeah, but I think that the new way is almost better because again, it's if you're really viewing your job as a portion of your life, then most of your life happens outside of your job. So you're going to have to like, where do I want to reside and what does that community look like versus I'll figure out my job. I'll get my job and then I'll figure out what my location and community look like
Right.
later. And I think that it's certainly a better way to do it. And so are what do you do now? Are you still in cybersecurity or cyber
No,
work?
so I transitioned out of that about a year ago. So now I'm actually starting my own practice doing like leadership coaching and change management. So primarily working with small and medium sized businesses. And so in some ways it's what I was doing before because when I was doing cybersecurity consulting, whenever projects start to go off the rails, it's always like a leadership or cultural issue under the table, kind of under the surface. And I realized I had to address this, otherwise the project's going to fail. And so I had to start doing some leadership coaching, working with teams, helping teams work better together, just doing the whole change management work. And so, and I realized that like I actually prefer that piece. I got a lot of passion, a lot of energy out of it. And so that's when I finally decided I'm just going to transition and start focusing on that full time.
And what was it like for you 'cause how many years at that point had you been doing cybersecurity work?
Gosh, well, in some ways you could argue since I got out of the academy, it's like
Yeah.
2001. So you could say it's 20 years, maybe only
Yeah.
10 years as the actual consultant. But
What do you think enabled you to make such a bold switch in your career? Like, do you yeah. What do you think really allowed you to do that?
I just noticed that I was going to work every day, getting on my calls, and I just noticed this, I guess, boredom setting in. It's kind of one of those things you've been doing it so long, the job is super easy. And there's one way that's great because of like super low stress, but there's also just this like, I wanted a challenge. I was getting bored. And then you notice that when you start getting that feeling about your job and notice you're like, you're not putting as much time into it, maybe not much effort into it. Maybe your quality starts going down. You're like, eventually that's going to catch up with me. And so I need to get to something where I'm like excited, expired. And so that's when I noticed that happening to myself, like, okay, it's time for me to do a switch of something. Either I got to drastically change my role in this company, or I just need to start my own company or move to a new company. And I took a long time thinking this through. It was probably a 2 or 3 year effort, really deciding what I wanted to do. But eventually, I think it just dawned on me that I spend so much of my time on personal development and investing in developing those skills. Why not just make that my job? That's what I'm passionate about. So why not make that where I get my income? And so once that happened, I think it was a pretty quick, within a year, I had fully transitioned over.
What do you think is one of the best so a lot of people in the military, we get out and we immediately go into like team leadership, which is automatically different, as you stated. What do you think is, in your opinion, one or two of the best resources people can consume or utilize to better prepare them for that cultural shift of leadership in the military versus leadership outside of the military?
I'm a big fan of coaching. I think everyone should get one, especially when you get in the military. That's kind of one of the first things I did. And I think it made such an impact on how I approached my very first job.
Mhm.
And I just think that there's a lot of good resources out there in terms of books and courses, but I think having that other human being that reflect and show your blind spot, you just can't beat it because each of us are just very unique as people, and books are always going to be a generic resource. It's never going to be custom tailored to you personally. So that's one thing I would highly recommend. And I think the other thing that I actually found really helpful is actually investing time in learning a personality system. That could be Myers-Briggs. I actually did the Enneagram, which I prefer. It doesn't really matter to be Strengths Finder because I think as you learn that, it helps you start to see that like we all have a certain perspective to which we see the world.
Mhm.
And And when you learn these systems, you can start getting a better sense of how other people, what their perspective is like.
Mm,
And so when you start working with a team, it's easier to shift. You can start to get a multi-perspective viewpoint.
okay.
And I think when you start working with a team, that's really what I think enables you to be a powerful leader.
And what was the system that you said you preferred over Myers-Briggs?
Called the Enneagram, Eneagram. And some people don't like it just because it's not as say, scientific. I like it just because I think it's only 9 types as to Myers-Briggs, which is, what is it? It's like 26 when you do all the little subtypes in there.
Yeah.
So I just think it's easier and it's easier to just visualize. Whereas I think Myers-Briggs, at least for me, it was almost too analytical to kind of like utilize in the moment of a conversation.
Interesting. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's really cool. And it's a perspective that I've never really considered with the because everyone takes the personality test to be like, this is what my personality is, which is I think important to understand how you work as a human being, which goes back to the self awareness that we talked about. But it also is really funny that like now that you've said that, it's really dawning on me like, oh, it probably would be a good idea to understand what the other categories of humans are, so I understand how I fit in with all of these other types of people, which is
Yeah.
really cool. So
Yeah. Especially if you can get to the point where you can, maybe not with a 100% precision, but if you're talking with someone, you'd be like, oh, I bet you're this type. First of all, that in order to do that, you have to take your listening down to a deeper level.
mm,
And so you're going to become a better listener, but
mhm,
then you'll be able to, it changes the relationship. You'll be able to relate to that person better because you're now viewing the conversation through their perspective.
mhm. That makes a lot of sense. As someone who's now working in this coaching, this leadership coaching and like change management business, what are some final pieces of advice that you would leave the listeners with in terms of how to prepare themselves holistically for their next life transition?
Right. We've talked a lot about the emotional and the mental preparation piece. And so I think that's a big one. And so, but I won't go much into that. So I think we've talked a lot about it. So I would say definitely pay attention to that. And I would say definitely like what you brought up the term community. And I think I say definitely pay attention to that.
Mm,
And I think it's real easy to, when you start going off on your career, it can very seem like this, like a journey that you're taking all alone.
mm,
And it's real easy to sink into that. And, but I think that if you could really lean into big community, not just your military community, but the broader community. And I think that's where you really start to identify both what's important to you, how you want to structure that lifestyle you're creating, and kind of opening up your eyes to things that you may not otherwise be considering.
mm. The question that I'll add on to that is how do you believe someone should foster community?
I think one of my favorite books is basically Never Eat Lunch Alone.
Mm,
You can take the artistic license with that, obviously, but, and I think the idea is, God, especially these days where we're all working from home.
mhm,
And I think there's never discount that face to face time and never discount just reaching out to people just to connect.
mhm,
And so, for example, like as I've been going through this transition myself, doing my own company, I've been making it a point of almost every day. I'll have a meeting set up, usually with someone from college, someone from the academy, someone from previous jobs, and just connecting and just
mm,
saying, this is what I'm doing. What are you doing? And I think as simple as that sounds, I think you start building that capacity for serendipity to happen.
yeah, I think that we're relational beings. And like you said, it's really easy to put yourself on an island in a lot of different circumstances if you're not careful because you can always
Right.
find something to do. And especially when you're transitioning out of the military, you go, well, I need to focus on all these things. And so then you just shut yourself off from your community. And that's where things can get real bad if you're not careful. And then the flip side of that is when you get out of the military, you're not used to making friends because you show up to your unit and it's like, hey, we're friends now.
It's,
and
it's so true.
yeah.
You're like handed a group of friends.
Exactly. And making friends is hard as an adult. And
I think
what do you
what
think
you
about that?
just kind of reminded me of is I think the other thing that I think is very successful is is basically seek out, I call them connection hubs.
Mm,
And so that could be, through athletic stuff. Like I joined the triathlon club here and
mhm,
made a whole group of friends that I wouldn't otherwise have. It could be through social clubs. It could just be living in the city, walking around. You just meet people on the streets. And I say, when you place yourself in these hubs, and I think that you start building a network that you wouldn't otherwise have.
mhm.
And because I think it's very true, post college, it's a thing where people struggle to make friends outside of work. Like,
Mhm.
like all your connections come through work. And I think you have to break out of that silo. You have to put yourself in these little hubs of community. And they're
Yeah,
everywhere, but you do have to seek them out, and it takes time and it takes some nurturing.
it definitely does take time and nurturing, but I would also say that community, much like the conversation we have had about life values and stocks, like all of your friends probably shouldn't be from one aspect of your life
Right.
because if I don't know who said this but I've heard a lot, which is you're like the average you're like the summation of I think it was like 5 or 10, like 5 people that you hang out with the most. And so
Mm,
if all of those people are from one aspect of your life, then you are all of a sudden going to become a lot more singularly focused as a human being versus if you have good deep friendships from many different places, then you become a more diversified human being, which is in your benefit, as we've already spoken about.
yeah. And I think because like I am traditionally an introvert. And so like I can be perfectly happy sitting at home with a book, working, writing, perfectly happy. But I think I had to force myself. And at first it's becoming very uncomfortable going to these networking events. Like they just had a USAFA networking event up here. And at first just kind of like you're walking into a room, like, I don't know a single person here.
Mhm.
And, but I think once you train yourself at like, no one's going to think it, you're tested. When you realize you're spinning the story in your head of what people are going to think if I just walk up to them and start talking, once you
Yep.
notice that and let it go of it, then you're able to just be very casual and gracious and open in these environments. And it's a great way to start building community.
I completely agree. Chris, it's been super great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts for the listeners?
Gosh, looking back at what we talked about, it sounds like the key points that are jumping out to me are seek out the people that cover your weaknesses.
Mhm.
And so like that means getting a career advisor, career coach, or a recruiter. Let them help you do all those things that is totally foreign to a person in the military.
Mhm.
And don't don't discount the inner work. So I think it's very easy to focus on our outside skills, learning things, reading, researching. That's all kind of external.
Mhm.
And don't discount the inner work and building up those muscles, like being okay with ambiguity, being comfortable and networking, that type of thing. Those are muscles that, they can it takes just like the gym, it takes time to build them and grow them. And so I think you should want to start working on them as soon as you realize you're going to start making that transition.
Mm. I think that's amazing advice and great summarization, by the way. You're really good at that. Thank you for coming on today, for taking the time to talk about your experiences, to give people your advice and wisdom. I am very grateful for that, and I know that the people who are listening are as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I love the project, and I think it's really important because it's a tough transition for a lot of people. So I'm glad that we're able to do this and help people make that transition more easily.
Yeah, I really hope that the information we put out here is making it easier for people who are either going through it or about to. And for everybody out there who's listening, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the post military podcast. I've been absolutely stoked to be able to provide you half a year's worth of content at this point, and I am excited to keep it going. So if this is your first time listening and you want to support the show, please like and subscribe and share on whatever platform that you're on, and we will catch you on the next episode of the Post Military Podcast. Peace.